We're excited to have two outstanding speakers today. First, we've got Dr. Ulrich from the Fed, who's going to talk about some fascinating information and prompt a lot of discussion. And we also have Dr. Edmunds from Vance Granville Community College, who's going to talk about some of the programs they have for getting people engaged in the workforce. So good. So first, I want to introduce Dr. Ulrich. She is a regional economist at the Charlotte branch of the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond. Previously, she was an associate dean of undergraduate programs and a professor of economics at Winthrop University. Those of you in South Carolina know Winthrop very well. She earned a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Georgia and a master's and doctorate in economics from the University of Tennessee. Prior to graduate school, she worked as a business consultant for Ernst & Young. You all will know that name. And in 2014, she served as a Fulbright scholar teaching economics in Kosovo, pretty interesting place to teach. And she spent considerable time working on local economic development issues in Bolivia, another really interesting place. Her research interests include higher education, school finance reform, local and state level tax expenditure analysis, welfare policy, and economic impact of local development. You'll also be interested to know that she serves on the executive committee of the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance. So she knows a lot about the day-to-day work of economic developers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ulrich, and she'll be able to share her screen. Please type questions in the chat. Penny will be monitoring the chat so that we can ask questions of Dr. Ulrich after her comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Crystal. Really happy to be here today. I was excited when Crystal asked me to share some of this research. She read some one of the papers I did on this topic, and happy to present it to you today. I do, since I work for the Fed, get to always remind people that the things I'm going to talk about today are my own opinions, and they don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. And I'll say this is kind of especially true when we're talking about this topic, because there's so much going on that sometimes, you know, I will kind of hypothesize a bit today about what I think is going on. So before we get started, I know you guys probably know all of these terms, but I just wanted to level set. And Crystal will be able to share these slides with you as well. But just wanted to make sure everybody had kind of a good foundation on what I'm talking about when I use these terms, because, you know, when I say labor force, that there is an actual definition, an economic data definition behind that. So the labor force includes all people age 16 and older who are either working or are actively seeking employment. So the labor force does not include people who are not working and not seeking employment. That could be because they're retired. It could be because they're a stay-at-home parent. It also can be, I think everybody on this call has a cousin who just lived on their mama's couch for a long time and didn't look for work. It includes that person too, okay? So once somebody's not actively seeking work, they're not counted as part of the labor force. Employed, I put the definition there and you can just kind of look at it, but a lot of times people wonder how the government actually decides if someone's employed or not, and you can see the definition there. And same thing with unemployed. When we talk about the labor force participation rate and the labor force, we also use this term of the civilian non-institutional population. So when we do this calculation, we want to take out the people who really can't be employed. So this includes people that are in jail. It includes people also that live in residential nursing facilities and places like that where there's no possibility for them to work. And so that gets us to our unemployment rate, which is the number of people who are unemployed, which is going to be those who are not working at all, not 1 hour, and are actively seeking employment. And that actively seeking employment could be posting a resume online. It could be searching sites like Indeed. It can be going to a temporary employment agency. It can be a whole range of things. And then the labor force participation rate, which is going to be most of what I talk about today, is that civilian labor force divided by the non-institutional population age 16 or older. So the labor force participation rate is really what percentage of those who could be working are either working or are actively looking for work. So let's talk briefly about kind of where we are now from an economic perspective, because this is important when we talk about labor force. So 2020 was extraordinarily volatile, largest 1/4 percentage decline in GDP and largest 1/4 expansion in GDP that we've seen since the Great Depression. what you'll see in just a second, I'll show you the numbers, is that GDP, so GDP is essentially everything that's produced within the boundaries of a country, final goods and services in a year. GDP has recovered at this point to pre-pandemic levels. So we've had a recovery in the amount of stuff we're making, but employment hasn't recovered fully. And as of August, which is the most recent data that we have, there were still 5.3 million fewer jobs than we had pre-pandemic. And that's a 3.4% decline. Many businesses are reporting having difficulty finding labor. I know you guys are hearing this all day from the contacts you have from work and probably friends and family as well. So even though there are seemingly all these people that don't have jobs, that had jobs before, it's still hard to find people. And we find that labor force participation rates remain pretty far below pre-COVID norms. And I'll argue today that the recovery for that is uncertain. I think there's some reasons to think that we might not see a full recovery there in the near term. Significant disparities exist between demographic groups. So COVID did not hit everyone equally. So if we look at who was impacted most by COVID, you will find that women's labor force participation, at least at first, was hit harder. Minorities were hit harder. People in lower wage jobs were hit harder. And then fiscal stimulus has played an important role here because it led to strong increases in consumer spending and saving. And it also has provided a significant amount of funds that have provided relief to state and local governments. And honestly, I think going forward, if we're looking at how to incentivize work, there might be some opportunities to use some of those funds to do that. So this is real GDP, and this is the last official data that comes out, and you can see that we have almost recovered to pre-COVID levels here. At the Fed, we have additional data that show us that now we are back to pre-COVID levels. This is really interesting for a couple reasons. Number one, you can see it's actually a pretty clean V-shaped recovery from COVID. And we believe that by the end of this year, not only will GDP have fully recovered, but we'll be back on the same slope as we were pre-COVID, as though it just never happened. That's pretty remarkable if you think about all that's happened in the last year and a half, that we're still producing as much as we did before, and that we can recover in a way that where it's as though it didn't happen. And unemployment rates are coming down. So I didn't want to make it too messy here. And I know Crystal is located in North Carolina. So I put North Carolina in the US here, but it would look similar for South Carolina and Virginia as well. Unemployment rates are coming down, but remember that unemployment rate is only looking at the people that are working or are actively seeking employment. So there are people that fall out of this equation. It doesn't tell us the whole story. So while unemployment rates are coming down, we can see that employment has been much slower to recover than GDP. So this looks pretty different from this, right? So with GDP, you can see there was this immediate recovery, and then the slope of the line changed, but still is relatively steep. Whereas with employment, it has not been as steep of a recovery. So we sometimes say this looks more like a check mark than a V. And all those numbers there, that shows the monthly employment loss or gain since the beginning of COVID. And we lost over 20 million jobs in 1 month last year. I mean, it's really unbelievable. That's just staggering. We need to add about 70,000 jobs a month to deal with population growth, but also to replace people who retire, pass away, things like that. So, a strong growth month in normal times would be really anything above about that amount, especially anything above about 100,000 jobs. So to think about losing almost 21 million jobs in 1 month is really overwhelming. Since then, we've added back a lot of jobs, but the recovery has been a bit slower than we would have liked to have seen. And specifically, the most recent release in August was disappointing at only 235,000 jobs added. This is labor force participation. This is most of what I'm going to focus on today. And as Crystal mentioned, I'm going to focus mostly on male labor force participation. The reason I've been doing some work on this is because a lot of the focus has been on female labor force participation. And you can imagine, as a female economist, I think that's very important for us to be talking about. But I don't think we're talking as much about what we're seeing in terms of male labor force participation. And actually, there were some kind of concerning downward trends in male labor force participation pre-COVID that I personally believe have been exacerbated by the current crisis. So that'll be mostly what I talk about today. So this goes all the way back to 1953, and the gray lines are recessions, okay? And what you'll see is that, so I'm going to go through and kind of explain what happened in each of these periods of time, but you can see that there was a large increase in labor force participation in the United States, really from like the 1960s to around 2000. But since then, we've been on a downward trajectory. So what happened? Well, between 1970 and 2000, let's say, we saw mostly an increase in labor force participation. There were a few years where it went down a little bit, but mostly it was an upward trend. That was driven by three things. The first and the most important was the influx of women entering the labor force. So female labor force participation over this 30-year period increased by 17 percentage points, really significant increase. The second thing that happened was the baby boom generation entered the labor force and entered working age. And that is such a big population that really improves labor force participation. And then the third thing is that people began to work longer because life expectancy increased pretty substantially over that 30-year period. So during that period of time, we saw more and more people working, several periods of relatively rapid economic growth during that period of time. Since 2000, though, it's been declining. So why would this be? It's not like we're seeing fewer women enter the labor force, right? Or that we've had some major trends that might explain the whole thing. Well, first of all, both male and female labor force participation have declined since 2000. However, there has been a much more substantial decline in male labor force participation when compared to female. So female labor force participation over those 19 years fell 2.3 percentage points and male fell 5.8. Specifically, there have been pretty significant declines in prime age male labor force participation. Prime age is 25 to 54. So those are that age where, you know, most people don't retire before age 54, and it kind of takes into consideration the fact that some people are in school until they're in their early 20s. And I'll discuss why this is as we go through the presentation. The next thing is we do have what some kind of called the graying of America, right? So the baby boom generation that increased labor force participation earlier in the 1970s to 2000 is now beginning to decline the labor force participation because they're retiring now in larger numbers. And then also another thing that happened was over this period of time, we did see a relatively large increase in the rates of disability in the United States. And by this, I specifically mean Social Security disability. We have seen those numbers go up, and we have seen the types of disabilities that people apply for go up as well. So for example, there have been more and more disability claims related to joint pain, which is typically associated with obesity. There have also been more and more disability claims related to things like alcoholism and drug abuse. So one thing I won't talk about today that I could really do a whole presentation on is opioid issues and how that impacts labor force participation, but that's a big part of the disability rates as well. So let's look at some of this. So this shows that labor force participation by gender from 1970 to the present. And you can see that female labor force participation grew really steadily from 1970 until about 2000. And during that time, male labor force participation was falling. So there was this trend of, you know, kind of a typical American household where the man works and the female doesn't, to where women were entering the labor force. And as women did enter labor forces, the labor force males were slowly declining in terms of their participation. And what you'll notice is while females increase and then decrease slightly, for the most part, male labor force participation has been on a downward trend since that time period, you know, from 80%, above 80% in 1970 to now around 67%, I think. If we look by race, and I zoomed in on this since 1990 so that you could see it better, there have been some interesting trends here. So this is male labor force participation by race. And you will see, if you look historically, Hispanic and Asian, if I had Asian on here, that's a smaller part of the population, so I didn't want to make it as messy and include all the race categories. But Hispanic and Asian males have higher labor force participation rates than Black males and white males. And that's kind of been the case for forever, for as long as we've measured it. The gap between white males and Black males is where the interesting changes have occurred. And one thing you'll notice is that white male labor force participation has consistently been above Black male labor force participation. But I want you to look at the numbers, the gap, right as we were getting to kind of pre-COVID. Okay, so right before COVID, actually, if we look at this next graph, we saw some of the lowest gap we had ever seen between Black male labor force participation and white male labor force participation. Now, one thing you will notice from this graph is that Black males were hit worse than white males. So if you look at this decline here in early 2020, the decline in white male labor force participation is smaller than the decline in Black male or Hispanic male. But you also may notice that at the same time, Black male labor force participation is now about where it was pre-COVID. It has nearly fully recovered at this point, whereas white male has not. And actually, I forgot to put it here with me. So if you look at the specific numbers, only about 38% of the white males that left the labor force when COVID hit have returned to the labor force, and it's almost 100% of Black males. It's like 99.1%, I believe. Okay, so white males weren't hit as hard, but they have not recovered as well. And I'll talk about why that might be. So because of that, you can see actually a couple of months ago, we hit the lowest levels of the gap between white and Black male labor force participation that we've seen. My guess would be ever, but certainly over the last 30 years. So I put this graph together that shows labor force participation rates by county. I thought you guys might want to see that for some of the counties you work in. And I know it's really small on your screens right now, probably, but Crystal could share this with you later. But what I did want to show you is that geography really matters in this, okay? Now, what this shows is labor force participation rate for prime age men. So once again, this is 25 to 50-year-old men. And the darkest blue counties on this map have labor force participation rates that are at 55% or under. There are actually 10 counties in the 5th district, so in our district, where male labor force participation rates are below 50%. These tend to be rural counties. These tend to be counties where there is a high percentage of prime age men on disability. These are counties oftentimes where things like opioids are playing a major role. The lightest colors there have prime age male labor force participation that is above 90%. These areas tend to be more urban. So the county where I live, York County, South Carolina, is one of these. It's a suburban county of Charlotte. Mecklenburg County is one of those. Wake County is one of those. So these tend to be the more urban counties. So why wouldn't prime age people be working? There are actually surveys that ask this, like if you're not working, why aren't you working? And one of the things, it'll be interesting to see what Dr. Edmunds has to say about this, during his presentation. But one of the things you'll note is that women, maybe not surprisingly, most often say, well, I'm not working because I'm taking care of my house or my children. Okay, so women who aren't working are kind of, stay-at-home moms or stay-at-home grandmas. Whereas males most often report that they're not working because they're going to school, but in actuality, this does not mean that they are actually going to school. They're reporting that they're not working because they want to go to school, but that doesn't mean this doesn't check to see if they're actually enrolled. And actually, if we look at male higher education data, we would see that those numbers have been falling as well. You will also see on the far left that men are much more likely to say that they are either ill or disabled. Specifically, white prime age men report the lowest levels of health of any demographic. Okay, so they report more often that they are in pain or that they are ill than any other demographic. So what does the literature say about these men that aren't working? I will tell you very honestly, the reason I started researching this many years ago was that I have 3 boys myself. I'm a mom of 3 sons, no daughters. And I started reading about the decline in male higher education enrollment when I was a professor. And I thought, this is so interesting. Why aren't these boys attending school? Maybe they're going into the military. Maybe they're going, what are they doing instead? And what I found was that there was a growing number of males that were not going to school or working. And so I started studying this to see what is it about male labor force participation that has changed over time. And one of the reasons is not a surprising one. And, Brookings study points out that manufacturing employment has declined 30% over the past 35 years. And a lot of the non-college going male population worked in manufacturing. And so there used to be these jobs in many of the towns where you guys live. It used to be possible for you to just get a high school degree and go work for the local plant and have a great career, right? You're not going to probably become a millionaire, but you could have a good job with good benefits and probably had a pension attached to that and retire well. And as those plants have closed, that reality just is not the case. It's not there for many, many people. And the manufacturing that does remain tends to be higher tech and does require some level of skill. So you can't just maybe graduate directly from high school and go into those jobs. You need to go to Vance Granville, or I know we have somebody on here from Piedmont Community College. You need to go to these places to get additional skills to get these good manufacturing jobs. And some authors, some economists, including Asmoglu and Autor, have found that there's a real skills mismatch. You hear this sometimes said, there's a skill mismatch between the need for people who have technological skills that can work in automated manufacturing and those that are in the labor force. Maybe more concerning is the more recent literature that is showing that there's actually a very strong relationship between the use of computer technology and non-working males. There is a survey called the National Time Use Survey and the American Time Use Survey, sorry. And the American Time Use Survey literally asks people, how are you spending your time every day? And people report exactly what they're doing. This is a shocking statistic to me, but non-working males spend 3.6 more hours per day on recreational computer use. And interestingly, they only spend 49 minutes more than males who work full-time. So we're comparing males to males. So males who work full-time compared to males that don't work at all. Males who don't work at all spend only 49 more minutes a day taking care of the home than males work full-time. And they actually spend less on caring for their children or elderly family members than full-time working males do. So it is not, we don't believe, a shift from maybe, where it used to be more common to have like a stay-at-home mother that's taking the kids, is this a shift more to stay-at-home fathers? That has become more common, but that's not what we're seeing on large scales based on the time use survey. And according to a new study, it's really interesting. They went in and these economists looked at that 21 to 30-year-old age group. So specifically what's going on with these like young, post-high school graduate men. And they found that the percentage of men working 0 hours more than doubled between 2000 to 2016. And that 75% of that decline could be explained by improvements in computer technology. So why is that important? So what they find is it's not just the existence of video games, it's the fact that computer technology has improved to the point where these games are very realistic, and they argue in their paper basically more addictive than they used to before. You can feel like you really are in like this fantasy land and get very drawn into these games. And so they find that 75% of that decline is due to improved computer technology. Incarceration is definitely another issue. A significant percentage of males who are not working have some criminal background. And a study by Mueller-Smith shows that each additional year of incarceration reduces post-release employment by 3.6 percentage points. And we actually have a recent economic brief that was done at the Richmond Fed that shows that males without a high school diploma who are incarcerated for the first time. So if you don't have a high school diploma and you go to jail once, your lifetime employment goes down by 50%. And that is because it's very difficult for people to find quality employment with criminal records. Now, I will say this is something we are hearing is changing quite a bit. We're hearing more and more companies say, we used to not allow for any past incarceration, but now if it's been a while, we're so desperate to find people, basically we're kind of opening up, broadening our reach. But this is based on pre-COVID data. Another really interesting topic, in my opinion, is delayed family formation and expanded adolescence. So median age of first marriage for men went from 23% in 1970 to 30.5 years in 2020. So 2020 was the first time that males on average, the average age of first marriage went above age 30. And there's a really cool new study from an economist named Ariel Binder, who looks at the fact that more and more women are going to college, fewer and fewer males are, and that those expanded educational and employment opportunities for women have lowered the benefit to marriage. So all the ladies on the call right now, you're all working women, right? So if you think about if you were, had come of age in 1950 and it was expected that you would not be working, you would really be looking for a guy with a really good job, right? Because he's got to take care of you and your future children. And so that was a big deal. But as more and more women have gone to college and have better employment opportunities, that benefit to marriage, the financial benefit to marriage, has gone down. And so what she has, especially with non-college educated men. So as more women are getting college educated, they're saying, maybe I don't want to get married to a non-college educated man if I'm going to have to take care of him, right? The reverse maybe doesn't look as attractive. And so she finds that that the reduction in marriage rates can explain roughly 1/4 of the decline in labor force participation of non-educated men. I actually find this research to be really interesting because another thing that's happening is this expanded adolescence. I'm going to show you some of the data in a second, but essentially, I'll oftentimes have people. Yesterday, I was presenting and somebody said, well, the reason we can't find people to work, it's all because of government benefits. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And I do think that has played some role. But what you'll also find is there's also a large percentage of middle income to higher income people who are allowing their young adult children not to live independently. So whether that is allowing them to live in their house or continuing to pay rent and things like that into their 20s, that has become more and more common over time. So this is a phenomenon that we're seeing across the income distribution. It's not just low income males that aren't working or just high income males that aren't working. It is a trend that we've seen kind of across the board. So what's happened since COVID? So all of this was going on before COVID. This was not new. This is what contributed to that decline we saw post 2000. Well, in 2020, all demographic groups saw significant declines. Some have recovered better than others. So like I showed you, Black male labor force participation has recovered much better than white male labor force participation. Why is this? So number one, some trends have simply been exacerbated. So that trend of people living at home in their 20s has been exacerbated. I'm going to show you that in a second. We have seen significant numbers of accelerated retirements. People have decided that they wanted to retire sooner than they anticipated. Some of this was driven by the quick move to work from home. People are like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to deal with the new technology. I'm out. Also, stock market has done very well during this period. And so people have also had larger 401k balances. So quite frankly, they were just able to retire earlier. Enhanced government support, including unemployment benefits, but also stimulus payments and the child tax credits that many of you guys, if you have children age 17 and under, are getting right now, those have maybe made it where people can be a little pickier about what job they take because they have had higher, larger balances in their bank accounts and people have saved more. Families have also made different work-life decisions. So there are a lot of families that have decided that maybe it's not worth it for one person to go back to school, back to work. And much of that, I believe, as a mother of 3 children, is driven by the difficulties in school and childcare schedules this past year. I don't know how it's been for all of you, but for me personally, it's been a disaster. So my youngest son is 11 and they finally went all back to school. And I was so happy the first day. I got so much work done. I told my husband, like, this is the best day ever. I'm finally working from home with no children here. This is amazing. And my son came home that day and said, I have a headache, and he had COVID. So then he was with me for 14 straight days. I was like, this is terrible. So anyway, so it's been hard, right? And if I wasn't able to sit here in my house and talk to you guys, if I was clocking in and out of a factory when that happened, my work life would have been very, very challenging for sure. Also, like I mentioned, more young people have moved home with their parents and they're not re-entering the labor force yet. And then the last thing I'll say is the pandemic is not over. People are still reporting that they are very afraid of catching COVID, especially in certain lines of work. I know some of you guys are from Eastern North Carolina, and there were a lot of meat processing plants there where there were major outbreaks of COVID. If you saw hundreds of people you work with get sick and know dozens of people who've passed away, you might really be afraid of going back to that job, right? That fear would not be an unfounded fear. So to show you guys, I know I'm rushing through all this, but I wanted you to have all these pictures so you can see them later. But to talk through a little bit of this, this is a really interesting measure that's called the NEAT rate. NEAT stands for not employed, neither employed or seeking education or training. So these are people that are not in school and are not seeking, getting an education. This is actually tracked internationally. And the reason is that actually young people in this age group, if they're not employed and they're not in school, this is actually thought of as kind of a dangerous thing, because young people, you know, especially if you think about in the Middle East, like young people in this age group might be able to get radicalized and you know, get wrapped up in terrorism, or in certain places can get wrapped up in other activity. And this is happening in the United States. You know, we have seen murder rates go up, for example, and part of this is that when the people in this age group are not busy doing the things they should be doing, they might get busy doing things they shouldn't be doing. So that's why this is tracked. And you'll see a couple of interesting trends here. One trend is look at the gap between males and females in 2006 compared to now. What COVID basically did was it took this trend that was already happening, which was the narrowing between males and females, and it totally collapsed it to where they're the same now. So there's basically the same percentages of males and females between ages of 20 and 24 that are not in school or working. The interesting thing about this is because it's ages 20 to 24, there are a good number of people who have children in that age group. And so you do have young mothers who that's why they're not working. And so it's interesting that we've seen that collapse. Another really shocking statistic, and you know, yesterday I had a man in a presentation I was doing, like really focused on unemployment benefits, and that's what's causing all of this. And I referenced this statistic, and I wished I'd had this slide to show him. This is the percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds that are living with their parents, at least one parent. That rate hit an all-time high in July, and it has remained high, and that was 52%. Okay, so 52% of people age 18 to 29 are living at home. That rate, when most of you guys, you know, graduated from college, was more in the 30%, 30 to 40% range. So this is a tremendous increase in the number of young people that are still living at home. Not surprisingly, young people in this age range that live from home work many fewer hours than those that don't, which makes sense, right? If somebody's paying for you to live, letting you live at home for free, you might not need to work as much as if you're having to live independently. I always joke with my children, I always say, I feel so sorry for you that your mother does this research, because not surprisingly, when my son turned 15, I'm like, go get a job bagging groceries. And when he was looking at colleges, I'm like, let's go, let's move into the dorm, because I do find this really interesting. It has become more culturally accepted for people to live with their parents until they are older and maybe not be working at the same amount. Now, what's interesting with this is this goes along with this delayed family formation. It makes sense, right? If you're not going to get married and have children until you're in your mid-30s, then do you really need to be on top of it at 23, 24? Maybe not. However, most of us realize that if you're not working hard at age 23, 24, 25, the probability that you're going to be working hard and successful at 35. So that's a lot of what's going on, I think. And I wanted to give you these statistics because I think you'll find it interesting. So there were two surveys that were done that I find really interesting. One was done by and they looked at the people that are not working. Found is 40% of those people, so 40% of those that lost their job during the pandemic, a major shift in their livelihoods. So 20% of people who were working pre-pandemic that had stopped working had decided only to work. 10% had decided they were going to start their own business, and we did see really increase during that time. And then another 10% have retired. And what you'll see with all these statistics, I'll let you read through them, is that a lot of them said they had made decisions to kind of change what they were doing before. And many people were not in a hurry to get right back to work. And interestingly, 16% of them did say that the money they got from the government was making it not worth looking for work. I talked to many people who prepare suppose that this is like 100% or 85%. It's 16%. And I'll show you data in a second that shows maybe it's even a little lower. There are other factors that are higher than that. And you could mark more than one factor. But 24% was related to childcare or elder care. 28% was related to the fact that there weren't jobs in industries where they wanted to work. And 26% was that people were afraid of COVID. And then 23% did have to do with that skills mismatch. Indeed, the giant job search platform also did a survey, and they split it so they can tell based on how people are clicking and what they're looking at, how urgently people are looking for work. And so they surveyed people that were not urgently searching. And what they found out is that people that didn't have a college degree were not urgent about seeking because they were most afraid of COVID itself. While people with a college degree, they weren't urgently searching because their spouse had a job, right? So this differs based on educational attainment. And you'll see that based on this. And probably not surprisingly, those without a college degree, unemployment payments were about 12% of why they weren't searching, while it was only about 5% of those with a college degree. So where does it go from here? I think it may be unreasonable to expect labor force participation to get to a full recovery anytime soon, because as I've mentioned, I think some of these trends were already going on and that this has exacerbated it. If it was becoming more common for people in their 20s to live at home and not work as much, this made it even more common, right? I also think people have been at home, maybe just playing. If video games were already an issue, they've been at home just playing video games for many months. And so it's a bigger problem, right? Drugs are a bigger problem. Mental health is a bigger problem. So I think some things that were already occurring are just exacerbated. But based on those survey results, I do believe that labor force participation will improve once COVID cases go down significantly. There are more normal childcare schedules. People feel comfortable putting their elders back into long-term care facilities. You know, during the height of COVID last year, people were really afraid to do that, right? You wouldn't be able to see your loved one and they might die, right? And when we do have a reduction in government support, which has already happened. And I do think that there are ways in which we could incentivize labor market outcomes. So that might be incentives to return to places like Vance Granville to get short-term training. And also maybe retention or employment bonuses rather than unemployment support. And there actually are states that are doing this with some of their ARPA stimulus money. So I will stop there. Crystal, do I take questions now or do we wait till the end? Or
now is good. I've got some questions for you that I'll just lead off with, and Penny will come some from the chat. But my first question is about the impact of baby boomer wealth. Baby boomers are the most wealthy generation. I was surprised to learn they have about $1.2 million in average net worth. So there are positive impacts, like maybe they're funding their kids' entrepreneurial ventures because we had record new business starts. But there's also negative, like letting them sit home and play video games rather than work. But talk about baby boomer wealth and how that plays into this.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think there are positive and negatives. I think there are baby boomers who are able to help their children buy a home and things like that, or like you said, start a business. But I think it's clear from some of the data that they also are likely the generation who have allowed adolescence to be really expanded. They are such a wealthy generation and such a large generation. And they are mainly the parents of the millennial generation, which we did see was a generation that where a lot of, I think, standards changed. It's interesting because a lot of things happened at the same time, right? Like the invention of things like the smartphone and the use of computer technology, it all kind of collided at the same time. But I do think, you know, when I was talking to the guy yesterday and he's so focused on unemployment benefits, which that is part of it. It's part of it. But at the same time, the room was full of people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, many of which have adult children living at home, right? So there are two sides of this. And I'm not saying there aren't situations where your adult children shouldn't be living at home, but we have seen an expansion of kind of the years of adolescence, and in some ways that's good, right? Maybe if you don't get married till you're older, you know better what you're doing, and all, you know, maybe divorce rates go down. I don't know, but there are negatives as well in that people maybe don't get started as early, which slows down or maybe reduces their lifetime income.
we have a lot of people here today who work in rural areas, and that map that showed where there's lower labor force participation in rural communities, and we know there's less opportunity there. But people just aren't mobile. They're not moving like they used to. I remember stories in my family of when people went to Norfolk for shipbuilding because the jobs were in Norfolk, or they, went to Detroit to work in auto plants because that's where the jobs were. Maybe talk about the changes in migration patterns and why rural places, maybe they just get stuck and they aren't moving.
Yeah, so we have seen in the census data that just came out recently showed this, that there has been a trend of moving from more rural places to more urban places. It's going to be really interesting to see how COVID changes that. There are going to be more people working remotely long-term. And especially in some of the biggest cities in America, there are a significant number of people who've been told you don't have to come back in person. Now, I think the question is, does that become a very long-term trend? Or is there just kind of a smaller generation of us that are told that now, and maybe we're always allowed to do it because we're kind of grandfathered in, but at some point they realize it's not the best thing, and people get brought back, or younger people have to go into work, whatever it is. I do think if there are rural places, actually, I've visited the town where Jerry lives up in North Carolina, and I think that's a great example. It's not far from a metro area. It's relatively close to a nice airport. It's off the interstate. You could get to a lot of places from Henderson, North Carolina very quickly. A place like that, I think, has a lot of opportunity to grow in more of a hybrid work, remote work environment, because there might be people where Henderson, it's an hour from Raleigh, that's too far to do every day. But if I'm only going in the office once or twice a week, maybe that doesn't become too far at that point, right? Or if I am living in Chicago, but I'm told I don't have to go back into the office in Chicago, I could buy something really nice in Vance County, North Carolina, compared to what I'm paying in Cook County, Illinois. So I think there are some opportunities for rural spaces to really benefit, but they have to have the underlying amenities. If you don't have good broadband, forget about it, right? I mean, people want, if you're going to be working from home, you need to have certain amenities to be willing to do that.
So I'll ask the participants to put in the chat maybe a surprising fact that you learned while Dr. Ulrich was speaking, and maybe that'll help with some question generation. I've got one more question, then I'm going to ask Penny to present questions from the chat. But put in a surprising fact that you learned. So if non-working men are not cleaning the house and they're not taking care of the kids, has there been any research that shows that may contribute to burnout of women working? Because if women are working and their partner is not working, but they're not cleaning the house and they're not taking care of the kids, it seems like that may be contributing to burnout. Is there any research on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There is some research on that. Probably not as much as there should be, because it is more of a recent trend. I think that there are a lot of studies that show that women who work tend to just it's not like they're spending a lot less hours on housework and childcare. They're just spending a lot more hours on work, and so are getting less sleep and things like that. And that can definitely lead to burnout. I do know that there are studies that show that there are more and more women choosing not to marry for that reason. Mm-hmm. That there are more and more women saying, like, I'll work hard and maybe I'll have children, right? Or adopt children or whatever. Like, I'll work really hard and take care of myself and my child, but I'm not going to take care of this guy who's not pulling his weight. Mm-hmm. And so there are studies showing that. There's actually a really good book. I hate the name of it, but it's really good. It's called The End of Men, which is a terrible title, but it's a book where a woman went and did research on these things. And she did things like go to college campuses and go to the libraries, and there's like no boys there. It's all girls studying. And it's interesting because there are issues related to this that you might not think about. So for example, there are now majority women who are graduating from law school and medical school. That sounds great. However, females are much more likely to want to work part-time as a doctor or an attorney. And so in that case, it's not a one-for-one replacement. Like if we have a shortage of doctors, it being more female grads could actually make that shortage of doctors worse, because you have more female doctors who are saying, hey, this is a great job. I can work part-time and still make $300,000 a year. So I'll work part-time, whereas male doctors are much less likely to do that. So there are actually, you know, while obviously I'm in a job where only 5% of people in my profession are American female. So I'm in a male dominated field. So I'm all about women doing that. There are considerations that have to be taken into account as well. Like if we're going to have female dominated medical schools, we might need to admit more people, for example. So it's not a one-to-one trade-off.
Good. Penny, what questions do we have from the chat?
Sure. I'm not sure if this is a question for an economist, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. With the many contributions to the decline in labor force participation, could flexibility in work like remote work or job sharing, could employer practices influence this? And can we begin to make recommendations to them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have talked to a number of manufacturers who have started doing kind of like after school shifts for women specifically, and being more flexible with that. I also know of a manufacturer in Columbia, South Carolina, medical manufacturer that offers very flexible shifts with an app where you can choose your shifts, and they have had a bunch of school teachers sign up to work there, and they'll work in the afternoons or evenings or, you know, weekends, summers. So we are seeing, I think there's some technology out there with scheduling and shift building now that's allowing even really traditional fields like manufacturing to become more flexible. I think though, we're also learning that, you know, it's difficult, even if you have the flexibility of remote work, that doesn't substitute like needing childcare. Right. So those of us who worked at home with our children for the past year, we know that that is not an easy thing to do. Right. I mean, I was literally on a media call one time and my son came running into the room, told me it was emergency. I had to get off right now. And when I got off the phone, he told me he needed a corn dog heated up in the microwave. Right. Like it was even my kids who have been taught not to bother me were interrupting me for a microwavable corn dog. So it's not easy to do. Right. So childcare remains a real issue. One of the things I think needs to be talked a lot more about that I hear, especially like from community colleges, is that right now when we think of childcare, we think about this full-time childcare from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. and it costs thousands of dollars a month, right? When maybe what a lot more people need is something that looks more, somebody told me the other day, what we really need is what they have at the YMCA, where you can drop your kid off for 3 hours and then come get them, you know, work out and come back and get them. Where we need more flexible options, not just for work, but also for childcare. I think that would help a lot of men and women re-enter the workforce or have more stable employment, right? Where they're not having to call out all the time or be late and things like that.
Penny, do we have one more question from chat?
Well, the other theme I'll say in the surprising facts in the chat were around the NEAT figures and looking at them from a lens of crime and other, you know, unattractive behaviors in your community. I wonder if you have any more comments about that, especially as people marketing their communities.
I do. So Crystal mentioned that I spent some time in Kosovo, and in Kosovo, unemployment rates were 52% when I was there, and they were really paying attention to this NEAT figure because people were becoming radicalized. There were no jobs. And so, you know, if there's, and actually the work in Bolivia, I've seen this too. If you are completely hopeless in terms of finding employment and somebody says, I'll give you $1,000 to take this bag of cocaine over that mountain, that sounds like a pretty good deal, right? People will make decisions that they wouldn't make if they did have hope of employment. So that is a figure that is really paid attention to. I think it's extraordinarily interesting because it does make sense that if you're not in school and you're not working and you're just spending a lot of times just looking, you know, I read something recently that 42% of Gen Z people are getting their financial advice from TikTok. That's terrifying, right? I'm seeing a lot of shocked faces on the screen because we were joking at the Fed that we're gonna have to start a TikTok, I guess. I keep telling my kids I'm gonna be the dancing economist. They don't like that, but if they're looking at social media and the way the social media algorithms get, and you can become radicalized in whatever it is, right? Whether it's politics or religion or whatever, or addicted to some game, it is concerning to see that percentage going up in the United States. That's something that, here's the difficulty though, Penny, is that these people are very difficult, I think Jerry would agree with this, to locate and identify and incentivize. Like, who are these folks, right? Because they're not working and they're not in school, they're not being tracked, right? We don't know who these people are. And especially females oftentimes might be in the system receiving Medicaid. If they have young children, they might be receiving Medicaid or TANF or other benefits. Males are much less likely to be in the system, so they're more difficult to track.
It sounds like we might be able to find them at GameStop.
Maybe so.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ulrich.
Thank you.
We're totally fascinated by this at Creative EDC, as you can tell, and I can tell you are too by the chat. So Dr. Ulrich, if you will unshare your screen, I'm going to introduce Dr. Edmunds, who I'm excited is going to talk to us about maybe some solutions for this conundrum. Dr. Edmunds is currently the Vice President of Workforce and Community Engagement at Vance Granville Community College in Henderson, North Carolina. He's been there since 2019. He previously served as Dean of Workforce and Economic Development at Halifax Community College in Weldon, North Carolina. And prior to that role at Halifax Community College, he served as a Small Business Center Director. So he has experience working with small business development as well. He's held a variety of executive leadership positions with Johnson & Johnson and IBM. So he has private sector experience of the year. And in his small business work, he was named Rookie of the Year, which I think is pretty interesting and fascinating. He earned his Bachelor of Business Administration with an emphasis in marketing from Marshall University and his Master of Science with an emphasis on human service management from Springfield College. And then he earned his doctoral degree in higher education leadership from Edgewood College in Madison, Wisconsin. He has a passion for rural development. And I thought it was kind of funny in the chat when Dr. Ulrich mentioned the book, The End of Men, which I have read. Dr. Edmunds said that kind of scared him a little bit. So he's going to share with us some programs at the community college that can help get men engaged. And then we're just going to have a conversation with him. So make sure you put some questions for Dr. Edmunds in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Crystal. And thank you all for inviting me. It is a little intimidating to speak to a women's group, and especially such esteemed women. And I'm always in awe of my good friend, Dr. Laura Ulrich, in terms of what she always presents to us, fascinating data, and a lot to unpack. Great questions, great dialogue. I also presented yesterday to our faculty and staff here at Vance Granville Community College on some of the data surrounding our student population. So in the interest of time, I'm actually not going to present that information. I will give you some top line data, which I think is fascinating. And I do believe that we really have to look at institution by institution in terms of kind of how the trends go. So let me explain a little bit about that statement. If we look at Vance Granville Community College, for example, as many of you know, the community college system within the community college is made up of credit and non-credit, or of curriculum and non-curriculum. And so I have the distinct honor of being the vice president of our non-credit or non-curriculum side of the house. So that includes a lot of the short-term training that was previously discussed. That includes things like basic law enforcement training. It includes fire and EMS. It includes things like our CDL truck driving course. And then on the curriculum side, those are the 2-year associate's degrees. And so here at Vance Granville Community College, it's interesting because as we juxtapose the two major areas of the community college, we find that on the curriculum side, the split seems to be approximately 70% female students versus only 30% male students. And it's the exact inverse when we look at the area that I have purview over. It's a male-dominated area. Again, when you take a look at law enforcement, you look at things like carpentry and HVAC and welding and all of those types of programs, heavy equipment, they tend to be male-dominated occupations. So as bleak as the outlook may look for those in the workforce, we still felt like, for example, 2 years ago, we started our CDLA truck driving course, and we really didn't want that to be exclusionary to women. We wanted that to be something that here in the area, we established a reputation of being inclusive regardless of what the particular field of study may be. So I'm also pleased to have purview over marketing for the community college. So we were intentional as we marketed that CDLA truck driving program to include our female instructors. We included our female deans in the advertising. And I'm pleased to say that it was very, very effective, because in any given class, and now we're in our 4th cohort, we have anywhere from 20 to 30% of our class is made up of female truck drivers. So that's just a testament to, I think, some of the demographics are by program as well. I will say that we have here at Advanced Grambling Community College, and while my actual dissertation research was in rural economic development, and looking at it through the lens of many of you on this call, looking at it through the lens of economic developers to see how the community college system here in North Carolina functions, and how and what factors affect rural economic development. It was so that is something that I'm very passionate about. But what we're looking at here at Advanced Grambling Community College is what are the areas that we can control in making equity a part of the fabric and the culture of our community college. For example, when we look at those students that either stop out or drop out completely, there's a common theme. Many of those students start with excessive tardiness, right? So excessive tardiness then leads to absenteeism, and then excessive absenteeism. And so we looked at some of our procedures around tardiness and absenteeism, and we didn't think that they were equitable. And we thought that we could be a little more sympathetic in terms of those working adults that are trying to work and juggle family, they're trying to juggle a job, they're trying to juggle perhaps a sick loved one, etc. And they're a couple of minutes late for a class, and all of a sudden it starts going downhill because of excessive tardiness and absenteeism. So those are the types of things that we're looking at on a case-by-case basis. And we are encouraging our instructors first of all, the instructors have to go by the protocol and the procedures, right? So it's incumbent upon us to ensure that we are on a consistent basis taking a look at those procedures and adjusting where necessary. But then we're also informing our instructors, and it was mentioned earlier, our employees as well. That was one of the questions. Was we all, in my opinion, have to be a little more, in my observation, have to be a little more sympathetic and a little more outreaching in scope and recruiting those students and recruiting those employees. And I'll pause here in a few moments and see if there's a specific question. But one of the things that I've kind of started to coin this phrase is that, right now it's an employee's marketplace. Right? It's the employees hold the cards. I spoke with the CEO earlier this morning, the CEO of Rose's Department Stores. They had a ribbon cutting this morning here in Henderson, which is where they're located. And according to the CEO, they continue to, they have the opportunity to move to a larger market, but their plan is to continue to invest in Henderson. And as I was speaking with him, he was more than willing to say, look, I will personally come and speak to your logistics class because we need folks that are in logistics. I will personally come and speak to your CDLA truck driving class because Rose's, we employ hundreds, if not thousands of truck drivers. So it's that kind of spirit of outreach that I think the real winners are going to be in this employment contest for talent. So with that, I'll just pause and say that's kind of a long-winded overview of some of the challenges and some of the strategies that we're taking here at Advanced Grambling Community College to, first of all, ensure that we're holding on to all of our students. This last point, and then I'll pause for questions. We identified over 800 former students here at Advanced Grambling Community College who had stopped out because of nominal financial need, right? So these are individuals that let's say $1,000 or less. Many of them, it was because of $300 or $400 that somewhere along the line, they had been unable to repay to the community college. And we've reached out to these over 800 students. I mean, that's out of a student population of about 3,000. So that's significant if we just get 50% of these students back, but we've reached out to them and said, hey, come back. We'll figure out a way to relieve that $300 or $400 burden that you had, that you were worried about, because if that student still knows that they don't have the money to pay, they're not coming back. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing to really engage our students in their education.
Dr. Edmunds, I know that the community college has a really hard time attracting African-American men and has had a hard time attracting Hispanic men, although I think that's been a little bit better later. Will you talk about the community college's Minority Male Success Program and maybe your experience with it, and how that might be a program that can engage a population that's been disengaged more so in the workforce?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have, in 2019, we formed what we refer to as the Male Achievement Academy. And there are other community colleges across the state that have similar programs. They may be named similarly, but they all have the same mission, and that is to provide support to, in particular, African-American males, because research has borne out that African-American males that don't feel supported are males in general, students in general, but in particular, African-American males seem to have a more difficult time on the job. They seem to have a more difficult time in the classroom for whatever reason. And certainly some of that are societal, though some of those are stereotypes that we're dealing with. We heard a lot about that in wake of the George Floyd homicide. So there are a lot of societal issues that come into play there. But the fact remains is that when any student has a mentor, so mentorship is a huge component of the Male Achievement Academy, whereby there's a formal mentorship program where the mentee is vetted and the mentor is vetted as well, and the two are aligned across similar interests, similar majors and occupations. And those individuals, and it's encouraged that they meet on the students' schedule, if you will. We try and find out, how does that student wish to engage? Is it by text? Is it by email? Is it by telephone call? Is it by them stopping by our office and having an in-face visit? We try and meet them where they are in terms of how, first of all, they wish to communicate, and then communicate on the frequency that, again, is comfortable for that student. So our entire disposition is that we try and meet the student where they are and offer them the support that's necessary for them to be successful. Currently, we're on our second full cohort. I'm sorry, we just started our third full cohort within that program, and typically there are 30 African-American male students, and it's not exclusive to African-American males. There, as you mentioned before, there's Latino, there's other ethnic groups that are in that as well. So, and then I'll also mention another important population that I think Dr. Ulrich mentioned earlier, and that's those formerly incarcerated or justice involved individuals. As we all know, more and more individuals are being released back into society. And that's obviously sometimes controversial. As we just yesterday saw the gentleman who tried to assassinate President Reagan being fully released back into society at 66 years of age, and he still has a lot more years to be in society. But the fact remains is that he needs to be, if he wishes to be, and others need to have the resources available to them to allow them to be productive citizens. So one of the areas that Vance Granville Community College and my department is heavily engaged in is that of prison reentry. We partner with a number of organizations. One of those organizations is local. It's called Gang Free. And they're, as the name may imply, they really, first of all, they're housed in a inner city community here within the town of Henderson. And it really does provide them and another partner organization, Family Resource Center, the opportunity to, as those that are justice involved are released back into society, they're then able to make a link to Van Scramble Community College, start to take some of those basic skills classes, start to take measures toward getting back to full employment. And by the way, when you speak with professionals that are closer to this issue, they tell us that the absolute worst scenario for an individual that's been incarcerated, especially, we just witnessed a video of a young man that's been incarcerated for 17 years. And he's been recently reintroduced into the community, and he's only 8 hours short of his degree. And so we're looking to bring him to Van Scramble Community College, where he will finish his degree. But the absolute worst case scenario is when we introduce those individuals back and we put them in immediate employment. There's no way that an individual that's been incarcerated for 17 years, just from a matter of a lot of things. So distance, so personal space, they tend to be when they're incarcerated, everyone is in close proximity. So they come back out and they get into close proximity of someone, and it's intimidating, right? So we're really setting them up and teaching them those things that here in a free society that may be detrimental to their employment or detrimental to their studies. So those are kind of two areas that we're focusing on that are specific to Black male success here at Van Scramble Community College.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Hetty, do we have a question from the chat that you want to pose to Dr. Edmunds?
Well, I hate to end on a COVID note, but Dr. Ulrich wonders if the pandemic, if you notice a difference in your students post-pandemic, have things returned to normal yet?
So great question. They have not returned to normal yet, but we are moving toward that end. Things are feeling a lot, and I think as a country, I mean, it's very similar to what we're experiencing across the country. You know, sporting events are starting to open up and things of that nature. But I will say that post-pandemic, we're getting back to, I think we all just didn't know how much, I mean, we had open house for our students, and myself and the faculty and staff, we were all like, yay. I mean, there's student, it was just so liberating to, you know, have students walking up to us saying, hey, I'm lost. You know, I'm where's, you know, building. It was just so liberating to have that interaction. So we're not 100% yet. There are still, for example, our convocation, which is typical for any kind of higher education organization. It was held in a hybrid fashion. So those who chose to come to the auditorium and maintain social distancing and mask wearing were certainly free to do that, but those that felt uncomfortable doing so, we had the Zoom set up as well. So we're confident that we're slowly but surely getting there, but we're still not quite back to normal yet. We're not back to pre-pandemic normal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edmunds. And you all know the technical college system in South Carolina, the community college systems in North Carolina and Virginia are a major #1 asset to economic developers. I want to leave you with one thought, and that's on-ramps. Economic developers will oftentimes play the role of convening business and education partnerships. And I'd like for you to think about on-ramps, making it easier to access education and training. You know, you have an on-ramp from high school to community college, but when that high school student is encouraged to go to 4-year, they're not quite ready, they don't succeed, they end up falling out, and then there's not a good on-ramp when you don't, when you're trying to come back from a 4-year to a community college, there's not a direct on-ramp. So think about how your organization can help business and education partnerships form a lot more on-ramps to training and to education and workforce development. I want to thank our creative EDC team, Penny Whitehart, who managed the chat, Billy Carter, who is the back scenes of this program today, and Heather Beard, who is also in the back scenes doing things today. I want to thank all of our team members. Thank all of you for participating. We will have our Women's Economic Development Network conference. Usually it's at the end of February. We're going to move it to early April, with the optimism that COVID will be past us and it'll be great and we can all be in person, shaking hands and sharing meals together. And so look for notice to hold the date for early April. This session has been recorded and we'll get that out to all of you and you can pass it around to others as well. So thank you very much, Dr. Ulrich and Dr. Edmunds for your great comments today. And thanks to everyone participating in the chat. It was good to see everybody. Take care.